welcome to the Therapy Corner. In this show, what we try to do is enlighten and educate on psychotherapy, counseling, and various other psychological topics that include mental health and well-being. Today, we feel very pleased and honored to have Thomas Steffora join us. Thomas Steffora is a licensed marriage family therapist in private practice, and he is also an instructor. He teaches at Pacifica Graduate Institute, and he is involved with Dignity Health at the Mission Hope Cancer Center, working with folks with cancer. So again, welcome, Tom. It's good to see you.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure, mind you, an absolute pleasure.
Thanks.
So today, you had said that you wanted to talk about depression, and I have talked before about depression as perhaps a normal part of our being in the world. And I understand you have a very interesting take on that.
Yeah, a lot of people are familiar with ideas like introversion and extroversion, or being an intuitive person or a sensate person as just traits of personality. One of the things that I'm often staying aware of when I'm working with people is sort of a defensive style that they have. And so what's a defensive style is really the style with which we approach anything life is throwing at us. And there's a number of them. There's 4 main ones in particular. So in terms of what they give us, those defensive styles, narcissism, which is sometimes referred to negatively, but positively, is the ability to be decisive, the ability to have a certain charisma and leadership, being histrionic, is able to advocate for oneself, to get one's needs met, to be able to sort of perform on the spot. A schizoid defensive style has the ability to kind of assess what's going on in the world and to look at patterns and to make sense of things. And so the one that I would want to focus on here today is depressive style. Now, a depressive style is often tuned to others' needs. It's looking out for others' interests, sometimes nurturing, sometimes being a good teammate, a good team member. And so it's really the person who is wanting to make sure that the other people around them are taken care of and that they fit in an overall scheme of things with other people. So that's a very kind of different way of thinking about how when we use the word depressive, what that might mean.
Interesting, because I hear a couple of things which harken back to some of the things that I've studied, in that it's not only just a survival mechanism, but there may in fact be a very positive aspect to it, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. I mean, all defensive styles are protective in nature. So there are ways in which we're going to effectively deal with life. There's something positive in each of them, but in a depressive, what it gives them is sort of an ability to join with others. And so that's something that, far from being just purely a negative as we would think of as depression as a problem, it's actually a way of being being with others in a way that matters.
Okay, well, we can all go to the DSM-5 and look up the criteria for depression.
Yeah.
Okay. What you're talking about is a little different than classical depression, is what I'm hearing also.
Yeah.
So can you draw the distinctions from a criteria level?
Sure. Like you said, there's a sort of clinical way to look at depression, which we would think of sort of sadness or anhedonia, meaning sort of a lack of not being able to take pleasure of anything in life. And when that reaches a certain level that we know emotionally we're kind of dealing with depression. And then there's a lot of body symptoms that go along with it too, whether we're staying in bed and sleeping too long, not sleeping enough, or eating too much, eating too little. All of those things factor into what we call depression. But as far as being a depressive, what that really is somebody who is more wanting to simply be helpful, integral to a group. And you might think of it like somebody says, we forgot the keys at home, who's going to go get it? And the person says, well, I'll go get it. And they go, but that's so far away. It's okay, I'd rather do it. I'd rather be the one that sort of takes this hit for the team and goes and takes care of that. So in a lot of ways, being depressive is actually comes across as loving. And so the reason why it's important to draw the distinction between what we call depression and depressiveness is because being a depressive is actually completely normal. And but oftentimes we are so hard on ourselves about that fact that we think that there is something wrong with us.
Good point. I often think of my clients who chastise themselves for exhibiting in their mind what are depressive symptoms.
Yeah.
And they beat themselves up only increasing their depression.
Yeah.
So you're saying that the depressive would be someone who does in fact chastise themselves. Would you say that might lead to an actual clinical depression?
It certainly can. I mean, what the central behavioral figure of or characteristic of somebody who's a depressive is at some point in one's life they heard, I'm not good enough, or I don't belong here, or I'm not worthy enough. And they took that exterior criticism and began doing it to themselves. And we call that a negative introjection. So depressives kind of become their own worst critics. And that's actually kind of ingenious, because if I can criticize myself worse than the world is going to do it to me, then it's going to make all other criticisms lesser by comparison, and it gives me something that I desperately need, which is control over it. If I'm the one criticizing myself, I can judge when I want to do it and when I don't want to do it. And so therein lies why it's a protective measure.
Interesting, because you used a very beautiful clinical term there to describe that. When I was in graduate school, we simply called it bad boy syndrome.
Yeah, and I think in some ways that kind of vernacular is even more helpful, because that's how we see it out in the world. We see people doing that to themselves in a variety of ways and call it those things.
Okay, so that's going to interfere with relationships.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, and it comes up in a kind of complex way. Nobody acts as a depressive all the time. And so all of those other defensive mechanisms, narcissism, histrionic, schizoid, and depressive, the most healthy, flexible people use those interchangeably throughout life in the way that they need them. And the fact that we sort of go towards one more than the other indicates sort of a preference and shows us who we are. But in terms of relationships, especially like romantic couple relationships, we've been kind of conditioned and shaped by society to behave in certain ways that match our roles. So kind of stereotypically, what we might see in the office is men tend to act a little more narcissistic in their relationships, whereas women can tend to be a little more histrionic in their relationships, because that's kind of how we've been shaped to behave to get what we need out of those relationships. And it's also hard to sort of parse out sometimes, because the way we're behaving in the relationship, maybe if I'm acting narcissistically but I see myself as a depressive, I might be getting criticized for things that don't feel like, oh, that's not me. I'm just behaving this way because I'm responding to you. Mm-hmm. And both parties do that to one another. So a person could be depressive in many areas of their life, but their partner's still calling them a jerk, and that they're behaving, as you say, in sort of bad boy ways and negative ways to one another.
So, you're a therapist. How would you deal with that in therapy?
I think part of the battle is illuminating what's happening. So oftentimes, if somebody is being criticized for acting out in jerky ways, we might need to look at the dynamic and what these two individuals are doing to provoke one another into a style that doesn't really feel at home to who they are. If we could reorient each individual back more into who they feel themselves to be, irrespective of the relationship, then you might not be seeing so many reactions that come out in terms of these antagonistic fights that are happening. And a lot of that comes into just communication style. So using I statements and being able to say, this is what I'm feeling, rather than say, you're always doing this, you're always doing that. We want to withdraw that sort of overgeneralizing, universalizing thing where we're pushing somebody into a response. Whereas when we identify just how we're feeling about something, that's much easier to be receptive to and hear what the needs of the other person are.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's one of the things that we do, of course, in existentialism is have the individual take ownership of their thoughts, feelings, ideas, etc. So I statements, as you said, are very, very important in an existential perspective. I was sitting with a colleague the other day, and he brought up sort of a very interesting approach. He calls it the triple A. And in the triple A, it's awareness, acceptance, and then action. And that's kind of what you're talking about, isn't it? It's like making the person aware of how they are in the relationship, not so much the other person, but how they are, and then coming to an acceptance of that's who they are at that moment in response to the other person, and then take an action to change that behavior. So,
no, absolutely.
Okay.
And to use your lead on that, I have my own acronym for CCC.
We're going to go through the alphabet.
Exactly. We'll cover all of them eventually. I view most all therapeutic interactions as either care, collaboration, or confrontation.
Ooh,
and
nice.
So if there is a lot of chaos happening within a relationship between two people or even just individually, I know that what they need, either together or individually, is care of some sort. If people are starting to make good decisions and the right kind of decisions for their lives and they just need to be further encouraged, then collaboration is what's needed. And when people are continually making poor decisions but expecting different results, we need to confront them. And that's something that we do with anyone that we love. And so it's an important part of therapy to know that any kind of interaction in a loving way is kind of crucial to what therapy is all about. And confrontation is not off the table when it's somebody that you really care about.
How true. I often have clients who state that they're very afraid of confrontation.
Yeah.
And I try to soften it with them by saying, excuse me, you're confronting me right now and I'm confronting you.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
a confrontation. It doesn't have to be loud screaming and yelling for it to be a confrontation. Try to soften the message a little.
Which is also a good indication, too, of what a positive narcissistic response would be to someone. Yeah. So it's a way in which leadership or confidence is displayed through the way we interact with people. So that's great.
Okay. So what else would you like us to know about the depressive person?
Yeah, one of the big pieces of my work is in with people going through medical conditions or a cancer battle. And there is a tendency for people who are depressive. First of all, they are one of the only groups that don't really think twice that they've received a serious diagnosis. They seem to take it in stride. And it's not so much an indication of pessimism, but it's that they've so inured themselves to receiving bad news in life, or that things could so often go in a bad way, that they're already prepared for it. And I think one of the challenges in working with those folks is, first of all, to let them know that just because they have a certain inclination to view things a certain way, that's not going to get in the way of their medical treatment. So this sort of idea that if I look at things too negatively, I'm not going to get better, that's not true. We have medical science that is incredibly helpful and effective at dealing with our problems. And it's also not to say that positive thinking isn't a wonderful thing. Positive thinking has a tremendous power to shape our emotion and our experience in ways that can lessen the burden in our lives. But depressives just need a little bit of a reminder sometimes that this is a condition, this is a battle that anybody could be going through, and that they haven't been fated to do this.
Interesting point that you bring out there in terms of the positive versus negative attitude towards their condition. I remember reading some years ago a piece of research that had been done on positive attitude versus negative attitude. And we all like to think, oh no, you have to have a positive attitude. No, actually it was shown that sometimes having a negative attitude produces a positive outcome, such as, I sometimes use cancer as an example. Interesting you should bring it up. But if you're going to go to your doctor for the results of your lab tests and the possibility is that he may tell you that you have cancer, well, going in with a positive attitude could be really bad, because if you go in there and say, oh, I'm going to be fine, the tests are deaf, and then he tells you have cancer, you're devastated.
Yeah.
On the other hand, if you go in with a negative attitude and say, oh, shit, he's going to tell me I've got cancer, I'm really messed up here, this is the end of my life, and he goes in and says, well, you got cancer. Oh, okay, that's what I thought. And it changes the whole approach to what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it's something it's commonly seen with anxiety, whereas in sort of normal modes of anxiety, there's a certain amount of vigilance that encourages towards life. And so being prepared and watching out for what might be coming down the road is a completely healthy and normal thing. Yeah. Only in excess does it get to be a burden. And so, again, that's where a depressive's sort of natural inclinations on things to be realistic, to be sort of concerned both with the larger aspects of life. What's this all about? Why am I going through this whole journey? Which is a kind of depressive inquiry in and itself. Yeah. That is normal, healthy, and should be encouraged in someone, not to be squashed.
Yeah, I hear you. So I know we had talked very briefly about this before the show, but one of the things that you mentioned, it may sound like it's way off base, but it is an important factor because you see a lot of what we used to call dual diagnosed individuals. Drugs and alcohol, how do they figure into what you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, no one is really, there's no sort of person or personality that would be immune from substance use or addiction issues. What we do see with depressives, though, is because of the sort of weight of the world feeling oftentimes and managing the expectations of so many people around them, there's a tendency to want to self-medicate. And so relieving oneself of that burden temporarily can be a very attractive idea. It's also, ironically, something that gets factored into whether depressives would consider going on medication, like an antidepressant medication, because they'll often feel, I don't really need this. It's not something that would indicate I have a problem. I don't really want to go down that road. Instead, I think that I'll just manage my stress by having a drink or 3 or 5 every night. And I usually have to remind, you're already using a medication. So it's not as though you're without the use of something in your life. You've just chosen to do it through alcohol or marijuana, which is, ever more common now.
Right. Interesting you should bring up medication and marijuana and all that, because as most people know, I have a real... let's stay away from meds, if at all possible. There's certain conditions under which I say, no, like the absolute depressive who can't get out of bed is going to need an antidepressant to get out of bed. Yeah. But I really try to steer people away, because I think what I'm seeing is what you're talking about is a lot of people with depressive ways of being in the world. They don't need meds. They need therapy, but they don't need meds. And so often in our society, we're prone to run to the medications.
Yeah.
And doctors are so prone to give out the medications.
Yeah.
And it's like, whoa, it's like the drinking. It's like it doesn't make it go away.
Yeah. I mean, if you consider that we all need self-soothing mechanisms, and if that self-soothing mechanism goes to one thing, maybe drinking or smoking, at the loss of all other forms of self-soothing, then we probably have an issue to deal with. If self-soothing takes the form of exercise, positive interactions, maybe intimate relationship with our partners, meditation, social activities, getting together with friends, and then social drinking is a part of that, then it's not really so much of a problem, right? So it really has to do with how well are we resourced and how diverse are our resources for self-soothing.
Oh, good point. Yeah, I like that, as in looking to support systems.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rather than going right for the Jim Beam.
Yeah, exactly.
You go to Jim and George and Harriet and, Mary instead.
Right, exactly. If we could build somewhat of a coalition of support in our lives, we would find that there wouldn't be the need for that one to go to all the time.
Okay, so we have about 4 minutes left. Anything else you'd like to share with what you're doing and what you feel the world needs in terms of therapy and well-being?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we all, in the field that and this is part of doing this, is that we can help advocate that therapy is something that is not just for mentally ill people, however that is construed, but is really a vehicle for exploring the difficulties and challenges of life that we're all going through. And so often we don't have good outlets for being able to discuss things in an unencumbered and confidential way. And I just believe in therapy so much, having done it myself and having taught it, and that it's an incredibly valuable addition to anyone's life to being able to have that outlet. And I'm enthusiastic about it. I'm enthusiastic about working with people with a complex set of problems, including medical problems, which oftentimes isn't necessarily thought of as a part of therapy, but bringing in what you're dealing with medically as well as emotionally and relationally, it's all vitally important to me.
Yeah, I'd just like to touch on a couple of things you said, because there was a very famous psychiatrist by the name of Thomas Steffora, shares your first name, who wrote a book, The Myth of Mental Illness. It's this whole idea that society has bestowed us with this label, to categorize people and put them off in a different world almost. And it's like another psychiatrist, very well known, had said that, insanity is a sane reaction to an insane situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Or Krishnamurti, who said it's no measure of mental health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. I think that that's an important thing to remember, that we find ourselves in a cultural mix of illness, disease, and problems that sometimes are largely outside of ourselves, but that doesn't also absolve us from our own way of struggling with life. And so by no means am I ignoring the cultural element and even the political and religious and spiritual, all of these different conflicting ideas that might be at play in one's life. All of those are very important, and how we are processing it internally is just as important. And so having, again, that space to do that within the therapeutic environment is invaluable.
Yeah, I know. I find myself going along that same line a lot of times in therapy, helping the individual to make sense of their reality because they're not seeing the sense that it does make.
Yeah.
Or the person that's beating themselves up unmercifully for something that's okay.
Yeah.
And it's like getting them to look at things through a different lens.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, shifting perspectives or reframes, as sometimes we talk about in therapy. I mean, just having somebody who can help you see the forest from the trees, which is sort of one of my favorite metaphors. That's oftentimes where I find people coming in, sort of a tangled knot, not being able to know what the next move is in their life, or not being able to see the forest from the trees. That's really a nice way of kind of stating where we're starting at in therapy.
That's beautiful. Starting there in therapy, because in the first show we talked about that in terms of the client understanding, and the public in general, understanding that we're here to assist the person attain a better perspective of who they are in the world that they may have lost because of exactly that, the forest for the trees.
Yeah.
And I even share with my clients, I've been in therapy a few times over the years, because sometimes I get in a position where I can't see the forest for the trees.
Yeah,
and I need that objective third party to help me see that.
And in most indications like that, what we're really trying to assist people in doing is to just become more of themselves.
Exactly.
We're not trying to change people into something other than they are, but allow them to be more of who they are.
That's right in keeping with existentialism and the authenticity, being you, not trying to be somebody else, but trying to be you fully and leading a fuller, better life for yourself.
Yeah, and existentialism has always been so powerful in pointing out the power of choice that we all have.
Right. Choice and responsibility for those choices.
Undoubtedly.
Yeah, and that's where some of us slip and slide away and forget to take responsibility for our choices.
It's true, but that's where we can help as well.
Exactly. So, Tom, I thank you so much for joining me on my show. I really appreciate you coming and talking about depression versus depressiveness and sharing a lot of your thoughts and ideas. So, again, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks so much, Oli.
Thank you, Tom. That was lovely. Okay. Thank you for watching this segment of the Therapy Corner. The Therapy Corner, as I said at the beginning of the show, is here to enlighten and educate. But we need your feedback. So please feel free to send comments, questions, or even suggestions for future shows. We plan on doing a variety of things to help, again, as I said, to enlighten, perhaps illustrate different ways of being, educate, promote the idea that well-being can be achieved by the individual who's willing to go there and be more well in the world, as I like to say. So again, thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to being here again for you soon. Take care. Almost funny if it were to say.
Yeah, it is. I mean, and it's a lot of sort of people are needing to see things in black and white. That's very sort of survival tone. I forgot that this was the person that I married for a million other reasons, and right now they're just driving me crazy. I can't stand what's coming out of their mouth. On both sides, right?
Right.